Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Today I ask you, are you willing to see the parts of yourself you've hidden? The child-woman archetype is not just theory, it's a mirror to your own vulnerability and untapped power. If you dare to look closely, you may discover that what you've called weakness has been your greatest strength all along. Carl Jung often reminded us that the psyche is not built from random fragments but from universal patterns, each carrying its own depth and purpose. Among these, the child-woman archetype stands as one of the most paradoxical and compelling images in Jung's exploration of the feminine. To Jung, she was not merely a poetic idea or a figure confined to myth. She was an expression of the collective unconscious, a living symbol that reveals something essential about how innocence and hidden power coexist within the human soul. When we speak of the Carl Jung child-woman archetype, we are speaking of an image that has both enchanted and unsettled generations, precisely because she embodies two qualities we are taught to think of as opposites: vulnerability and potency. In Jung's view, archetypes are not inventions of the conscious mind. They are pre-existing patterns that shape our perceptions and influence our actions, often without us realizing it. The child-woman is one of these patterns. At first glance, she appears as innocence incarnate, unformed, delicate, seemingly untouched by the harshness of life. She is the figure that evokes tenderness and the instinct to protect. Yet beneath this outward fragility lies a subtle but undeniable force. It is not the force of dominance or aggression, but the kind of influence that draws others into her orbit. She does not command through power displayed. She compels through the deep, often unconscious responses she awakens in those around her. Jung saw this paradox as key to understanding her archetype. The child-woman holds sway not because she seeks it, but because she embodies something primordial in the psyche, the tension between potential and fulfillment. Her innocence acts as a mirror, reflecting to others their own longing for purity, safety, and wonder. But it is also a catalyst, stirring impulses and desires that may have been dormant or unacknowledged. In this way, her archetype reveals a truth Jung often emphasized: that the most powerful forces in the psyche are not always the most obvious, and that what appears fragile can be the very thing that alters the course of a life. This is why Jung placed such importance on seeing the archetype in its wholeness. If we romanticize the child-woman's innocence without acknowledging her power, we risk idealizing her in ways that lead to distortion and projection. If we recognize only her subtle influence without honoring her vulnerability, we risk reducing her to a manipulative force. Jung's psychology urges us to hold both sides together, to see her as an image of duality, one that reflects our own inner contradictions. In everyday life, the child-woman archetype can appear in various forms. She may be a person who naturally evokes a sense of guardianship in others, or a presence whose openness seems to awaken something deeply protective in those who meet her. She might even appear within ourselves, as that part of us that longs to be cared for, seen and sheltered, yet simultaneously holds the power to change others simply through our being. Jung believed that recognizing this archetype in our lives is not about labeling people, but about seeing the underlying pattern that shapes interactions. When we see it, we can begin to navigate it consciously, rather than being unconsciously carried along by it. Myth and literature are filled with examples of the child-woman, which is further proof of her universality. In fairy tales, she might be the young maiden who, despite her apparent helplessness, transforms the fate of the hero through her very presence. In epic stories, she may be the figure whose innocence becomes the reason for great acts of courage, sacrifice, or change. Jung understood these stories not as mere entertainment, but as symbolic expressions of inner realities. The child-woman's role in them is to embody the unfinished, the unclaimed potential that draws forth hidden capacities in those who encounter her. In psychological terms, the child-woman archetype challenges our conventional understanding of strength and weakness. Modern culture often equates strength with independence, assertiveness, and control, while labeling vulnerability as weakness. Yet Jung's perspective disrupts this binary. The child-woman shows us that vulnerability itself can be a kind of strength, one that invites connection, elicits care, and fosters transformation. Her influence does not come from overpowering others, but from creating a space where others feel called to act, protect, or nurture. This is power, in its most subtle form, and it is precisely this subtlety that makes it so enduring. However, Jung also warned of the dangers inherent in such archetypal energy. When unacknowledged, the child woman can dominate the psyche from the shadows. A person embodying this archetype unconsciously might resist maturity, preferring to remain in a position of being cared for rather than stepping into self-responsibility. Likewise, those responding to her might unconsciously fall into roles of savior or protector, investing themselves in her perceived fragility without recognizing their own motivations. Jung's framework helps us see that these dynamics are not about fault or blame, but about the natural pull of archetypal forces. Awareness is the key to transforming them. In Jung's broader vision of individuation, the process of becoming whole, the child-woman archetype has an essential role. She invites us to integrate qualities that might otherwise seem incompatible: the openness of innocence and the groundedness of strength, the willingness to receive and the capacity to influence. She challenges us to recognize that our own vulnerability is not something to be hidden or overcome, but something to be understood and expressed with consciousness. When we do this, we not only integrate her energy into our own psyche, but also free ourselves from the unconscious patterns she might otherwise create in our relationships. The Carl Jung child-woman archetype, in this light, is not just a figure in psychological theory, but a living reality that touches personal, relational, and cultural dimensions of life. She shows us that power can be soft, that influence can be quiet, and that the deepest transformations often arise from the most delicate beginnings. In her, Jung found an image that calls us to look past appearances, to hold the paradox of vulnerability and potency in our own lives, and to see in that paradox the very heart of the human journey toward wholeness. Carl Jung often emphasized that the symbols and figures we meet in our inner world are not random, but deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, carrying with them the wisdom and complexity of countless generations. The child woman, as seen through the lens of the child woman symbol in Jungian psychology, is one of the most layered and paradoxical of these figures. She appears not as an accidental personality trait or as a fleeting mood, but as an enduring archetype, a universal pattern of human experience that holds profound meaning for both individual growth and cultural understanding. To grasp her fully, we must look beyond the surface image of innocence and fragility to see the psychological forces she represents. In Jungian thought, symbols are living realities in the psyche. They are not fixed, and they are never as simple as they first appear. The child-woman symbol, at first glance, embodies youth, openness, and receptivity, qualities that can inspire a sense of care and protection in those who encounter her. Yet Jung would warn us that to stop there is to miss the heart of the archetype. Symbols always carry a dual nature: the light, which shows their creative and life-giving potential, and the shadow, which reveals their capacity to disrupt, entangle, or hold us back. In the case of the child woman, her light is the power to awaken tenderness, inspire trust, and reconnect us to our own sense of wonder. Her shadow, however, lies in the subtle influence that vulnerability can exert, sometimes binding others into patterns of saviorhood, or keeping the self from stepping fully into maturity. Carl Jung often spoke of the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine forces within each person. Within the early forms of the anima, we find the child woman as a potent presence. She may represent the anima in its youthful phase, where the feminine is experienced as pure, delicate, and unspoiled, yet also deeply compelling. This phase can be both a source of inspiration and a source of projection. Jung described projection as the unconscious act of placing one's own inner images onto another person. When the child-woman symbol is projected onto someone in real life, the perceiver may believe they are responding to that person as they truly are, when in fact, they are engaging with an archetype that exists primarily within their own psyche. The symbolic power of the child-woman extends far beyond individual relationships. Across myth, literature, and film, we encounter her in countless forms: the maiden in need of rescue, the ingenue, whose very presence alters the hero's destiny, the fragile figure whose survival becomes the central quest. Jung saw such recurring stories as proof that the archetype is not confined to personal psychology, but is woven into the cultural imagination. These images endure because they touch something timeless, the human response to vulnerability, the instinct to protect, and the deep fascination with the moment between innocence and transformation. Yet Jung also recognized the dangers of this fascination. In the realm of the shadow feminine archetypes, the child woman can be used unconsciously to hold power over others without overtly appearing to do so. Vulnerability, when it becomes a habitual way of relating, can lead to a kind of passive control, drawing others in, evoking their care, and keeping them invested without requiring mutual growth or equality. This dynamic is rarely intentional, rather it arises from the archetype operating outside of awareness. Jung's approach was never to condemn such dynamics, but to illuminate them, so that both parties in such a relationship could see the underlying forces at work and choose a more conscious way of engaging. The child-woman symbol in Jungian psychology also has much to teach us about our own internal landscapes. For many, she appears as the part of the self that remains untouched by cynicism, the inner figure who still believes in beauty, goodness, and possibility. She may also represent the aspects of the self that long to be cared for and sheltered. Jung believed that meeting this inner figure with compassion is essential. Ignoring her can lead to a loss of connection with the softer, more receptive parts of the psyche, while over-identifying with her can prevent the development of autonomy and self-reliance. In dreams, the child woman may appear in symbolic settings that amplify her meaning, standing at a doorway, crossing a bridge, or being guided by others. These images often speak to transitional moments in life, where one is moving from one stage of development to another. The child woman in such dreams may signal the need to honor vulnerability during a time of change, or she may point to the necessity of taking greater responsibility for one's path. Jung taught that paying attention to these symbolic appearances is not just an intellectual exercise but a way of listening to the psyche itself. What makes the child woman symbol so striking in Jungian terms is her capacity to blur the lines between power and helplessness. She forces us to question our definitions of both. Is power only the ability to act decisively and assert control, or can it also be the ability to move others profoundly through openness and need? Is helplessness always a sign of weakness, or can it be a stage on the way to transformation, one that invites connection and support? Jung's work with archetypes invites us to hold these questions without rushing to easy answers. Ultimately, the child woman's symbolism calls for integration. We are meant to see her for what she is, not a literal person, but an image that lives in the psyche, influencing thoughts, feelings, and relationships. When we recognize her, we can begin to engage with her consciously. This means valuing her gifts, her ability to inspire care, to soften hardened hearts, and to remind us of the beauty in fragility. But it also means guarding against her shadow, the tendency to use vulnerability as a shield against growth or as a subtle means of control. In the balance between these two lies the real educational value of understanding her symbol. Jung would say that by engaging with such symbols in their fullness, we take a step closer to the wholeness that is the goal of individuation, and in doing so, we uncover not just the truth about the child woman, but the truth about ourselves. Carl Jung often returned to the idea that the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine principles within every person, hold enormous power over our perceptions, relationships, and inner development. In this framework, the child woman emerges as one of the most delicate yet deeply influential forms of the anima. When examined through the Carl Jung anima and animus lens, she is not just a romanticized vision of youth and beauty, but an archetypal force that can shape the emotional, spiritual, and relational patterns of those who encounter her. Her energy, though subtle, can command attention, stir deep emotions, and awaken hidden longings, all without a single overt demand. To Jung, the child woman's anima form represents an early stage of the feminine within the psyche, one that has not yet matured into the depth of the mother archetype or the wisdom of the crone. She embodies potential rather than completion, promise rather than fulfillment. This potential is precisely what makes her so compelling. For the feminine psyche, she may represent an inner state of receptivity and emotional sensitivity that is both cherished and feared. Jung saw that the anima in this child-woman phase often evokes projection. Projection, as he defined it, is the unconscious act of seeing our own inner image in another person and believing it belongs to them. When someone encounters the child woman, they may not be relating to the actual individual before them, but to the archetype she activates in their own unconscious. This projection can be intoxicating. It can create bonds of deep fascination and emotional investment. Yet, because projection is rooted in the inner world rather than reality, it also carries the potential for disappointment and disillusionment once the real person diverges from the idealized image. From an educational standpoint, understanding the child woman through the Carl Jung anima and animus perspective requires us to explore how she functions not just in outer relationships, but also in our own inner lives. For a man, she may represent the part of himself that is tender, emotionally attuned, and capable of deep connection. For a woman, she might appear as a younger, more innocent aspect of herself that longs to be nurtured and protected, or as a version of femininity she feels pressured to embody. In both cases, she points toward qualities that need to be integrated rather than idealized or denied. In myths and stories, this form of the anima appears in countless guises: the maiden who inspires the hero's quest, the muse whose beauty or vulnerability changes the fate of the protagonist, the figure whose mere presence stirs courage, creativity, or transformation. Jung understood these recurring images as expressions of the psyche's structure. They are not accidental plot devices, but symbolic enactments of how the anima draws the conscious mind into a deeper relationship with the unconscious. The child woman, as a stage of the anima, invites exploration, not possession. She calls forth movement, not stagnation. However, Jung also warned of the dangers when the child woman remains unintegrated. If a person becomes overly fixated on this anima image, they may seek it compulsively in others, mistaking the archetypal pull for personal destiny. This can lead to relationships based less on mutual reality and more on the unconscious need to complete oneself through another. For the person embodying the child-woman energy, there is the temptation to remain in a position of being adored or protected, avoiding the challenges of developing autonomy, responsibility, and self-definition. The key to working with this archetype in a healthy way lies in consciousness. When we recognize that the child-woman, as part of the anima, lives within us, we are less likely to project her entirely onto someone else. This means learning to nurture and protect our own vulnerability, to honor the qualities of openness and trust she represents, without expecting another person to carry them for us. Jung's process of individuation, the integration of the conscious and unconscious, is served by this kind of work. It transforms the child woman from an externalized fantasy into an internal ally, a part of the self that can inspire growth without creating dependence. In dreams, the child woman in her anima form often appears in situations that demand some form of choice or transition. She might be standing at the edge of a forest, waiting to be guided, or offering something precious that requires courage to accept. Jung believed these dream encounters are invitations to engage with the anima consciously, to understand what she symbolizes in that moment, and how her qualities might be integrated into waking life. Her presence in dreams is rarely passive. Even in stillness, she prompts movement, decision, and self-reflection. From a broader cultural perspective, the fascination with the child-woman anima form reveals a great deal about how societies relate to femininity. Often, there is an idealization of youth, innocence, and beauty, accompanied by a reluctance to value maturity, wisdom, and strength in equal measure. Jung's insights challenge this imbalance. He recognized that while the child-woman stage of the anima can be inspiring, it is only one phase in the fuller expression of the feminine psyche. To remain fixated here is to limit growth. To move beyond it is to embrace a more complete and grounded relationship with the inner feminine. Ultimately, Carl Jung's exploration of the child-woman through the anima and animus framework shows us that she is not a static figure, but part of a dynamic psychological process. She reflects both our longing for purity and our need for connection, both our openness to life and our reluctance to face its complexities. Her influence can be profound, shaping choices, inspiring creativity, and deepening relationships, but only when we approach her with awareness. Without that awareness, we risk becoming caught in her allure, chasing an ideal that exists more in our psyche than in the world. By recognizing her as an inner image, we can honor her beauty and vulnerability, while also making space for the fuller, richer expressions of the feminine that lie beyond her. This is the work Jung would invite us to undertake, not to escape the child woman, but to integrate her into the wholeness of who we are. Carl Jung often said that symbols are the language of the unconscious, and that they hold truths far greater than the literal mind can grasp. The child woman archetype, when seen as the hidden meaning of the child woman archetype, is one such symbol that unsettles as much as it enlightens. She is a living paradox, a reminder that the human psyche is never simple, and that appearances often conceal layers of complexity. To Jung, her image was more than a romanticized ideal or a poetic construction. It was a mirror reflecting deep truths about vulnerability, influence, and the interplay between innocence and power. The hidden meaning of this archetype lies in its ability to overturn our conventional assumptions. In the conscious mind, vulnerability is often equated with weakness, something to be protected or outgrown. Power, on the other hand, is seen as strength, independence, and control. But the child woman forces us to reconsider these definitions. She demonstrates that vulnerability itself can be a potent form of influence, and that what appears most fragile may exert the greatest pull on the human heart and mind. Jung understood this as a psychological law. The more we are moved by something emotionally, the more deeply it embeds itself in our behavior and choices, regardless of whether we recognize it consciously. Her power is not the power of force, it is the power of presence. She draws people toward her not by commanding, but by evoking care, tenderness, and a sense of responsibility. This is why Jung warned that archetypes like the child woman must be approached with awareness. Left unexamined, the responses she awakens can lead to patterns that seem altruistic on the surface, but are driven by unconscious needs or unresolved inner images. A person may dedicate themselves to protecting her, not realizing that what they are protecting is an idealized projection of their own inner longing for innocence or unspoiled connection. The hidden meaning also resides in the way this archetype engages the shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow refers to the parts of the psyche we deny or ignore. Traits, desires, and capacities we disown, because they conflict with our conscious self-image. The child woman, in her shadow form, may unconsciously use her vulnerability as a shield, resisting growth by keeping others engaged in the role of caretaker or savior. In turn, those who respond to her may project onto her the parts of themselves they fear to own: tenderness, dependency, or a yearning for simplicity in a complex world. The relationship becomes a closed loop of projections, where neither party is fully seeing the other as they are. In dreams and myths, the child woman often appears in liminal spaces, a young girl on the threshold of a door, a figure in need of guidance through a dark forest, or a delicate presence in the company of forces much larger than herself. These images are not accidental. Jung taught that thresholds represent moments of transition in the psyche, where old structures are dissolving and new potentials are emerging. The child woman at these points may symbolize the part of the self that is emerging into a new stage of life, but has not yet developed the strength to stand alone. Her vulnerability in such moments is both her risk and her strength. It invites the attention and resources of the outer and inner worlds. From an educational standpoint, the hidden meaning of this archetype is that vulnerability and influence are not mutually exclusive. They can, and often do, coexist. The child woman shows us that being open, receptive, and unguarded can have a profound effect on others, often more than overt control or dominance could achieve. This challenges the cultural narrative that to have impact, one must be loud, assertive, or in command. Jung's insight here is that the psyche recognizes and responds to many forms of power, some of which operate in silence and subtlety. However, the archetype's meaning is not purely uplifting. Jung understood that the same qualities that inspire connection can also create dependency. When the child woman is held too tightly, whether in the psyche or in relationships, she can become a fixed image, preventing both herself and others from evolving. The protector may resist letting her grow for fear of losing their role. She may resist stepping into autonomy for fear of losing care and attention. This is why awareness is so crucial in working with her symbolism. The goal is not to reject her, but to allow her qualities to integrate into a more complete self. Culturally, the fascination with the child-woman archetype reveals a great deal about societal attitudes toward femininity. Many cultures idealize the freshness, innocence, and beauty associated with youth, while undervaluing the depth, authority, and resilience that come with age and experience. Jung would see this as an incomplete understanding of the feminine principle, one that risks trapping both men and women in a narrow definition of value. The hidden meaning here is that the child woman is not the end state of feminine expression. She is a beginning, a doorway to deeper forms of wisdom and strength. To remain fixated on her image is to stay at the threshold and never fully enter the house of the self. The most transformative aspect of Jung's insight into this archetype is his invitation to see her as part of oneself, rather than solely in others. In each of us, there is a child-woman figure, the part that longs for safety, that inspires others with openness, and that may hesitate to step fully into the unknown. By acknowledging her, we can protect her innocence while also guiding her toward growth. This process is what Jung called individuation, the integration of all aspects of the self into a unified whole. The hidden meaning of the child-woman archetype, then, is ultimately about the integration of paradox. She teaches that vulnerability can carry authority, that gentleness can lead to profound transformation, and that power can live quietly within the folds of innocence. Jung's brilliance was in showing us that these qualities, when held in balance, enrich the psyche rather than divide it. To work with her consciously is to accept that human strength is not always a matter of dominance, but often a matter of presence, a truth that once understood can change not only how we see others, but how we see ourselves. Carl Jung's exploration of the child-woman archetype reminds us that the human psyche is built on paradox, innocence entwined with power, vulnerability interlaced with influence, dependence standing beside autonomy. Across all her forms, whether as anima, shadow, or symbolic image, the child woman challenges us to see beyond appearances and to confront the unconscious patterns that shape our relationships, our self-image, and our growth. She is not merely a figure from myth or psychology, but a living presence in our inner world, asking us to integrate her qualities with awareness. By doing so, we preserve her openness without becoming trapped in her fragility, honor her influence without succumbing to her shadow, and allow her to guide us toward individuation. Jung's great gift was showing us that wholeness is born from embracing such tensions, and in embracing the child woman, we are invited to meet the most delicate parts of ourselves, not with fear, but with respect, curiosity, and a willingness to grow.